I trusted my boss, but he used me as a scapegoat. When the company was on the brink of bankruptcy, he blamed everything on me and fired me to cover up his schemes. But he didn't know that I had kept copies of all his dark dealings. The leather chair in Mark Henderson's office always felt like a throne, sleek, expensive, and designed to make anyone sitting across from it feel small. I'd seen countless people squirm in the visitor's chair over my 6 years at Vertex Solutions, but I never thought I'd be the one sweating through my collar, watching Mark's practiced smile fade into something darker. "Alex, you've been like family to me," he said, his voice carrying that practiced note of concern that had fooled so many before. "That's why this hurts so much. I should have seen it coming." The whispers in the break room, the sudden closed-door meetings I wasn't invited to, the way Sandra from accounting couldn't meet my eyes in the elevator that morning. But when you've given everything to a company, your ideas, your time, your sanity, you tend to miss the signs that you're about to be sacrificed. "The auditors found some concerning patterns," Mark continued, sliding a folder across his mahogany desk. "Wire transfers to shell companies, doctored invoices, creative accounting that's left us exposed. All of it traces back to your department." My hands didn't shake as I opened the folder. They should have, but 6 years of handling corporate crises had taught me to keep my composure. The documents inside were a masterpiece of misdirection. Every questionable transaction I'd questioned over the years, every irregular payment I'd flagged to Mark himself, now carefully reorganized to point directly at me. "This is impressive," I said, keeping my voice level. "How long did it take you to put this together?" Mark's smile flickered. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of something cold behind his carefully cultivated image of the concerned mentor. "Alex, I know this is difficult to process. But the evidence is clear. The board needs someone to take responsibility, and the paper trail, well, it all leads to you." I closed the folder and met his gaze. "You know exactly what you're doing, don't you?" He leaned back, adjusting his custom-made suit. "What I know is that we're facing a potential catastrophe. The company needs a clean break to survive. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made for the greater good." The greater good. That's what he'd said 3 years ago when we had to lay off half the development team. 2 years ago when we acquired our biggest competitor through what I now realized were fraudulent valuations. 1 year ago when he convinced me to sign off on a series of offshore transactions that would revolutionize our tax efficiency. I had been so blind. "The board meets tomorrow," Mark said, standing to indicate our meeting was over. "For your years of service, I'm offering you a chance to resign quietly. Full severance, good recommendations, a clean break. The alternative, well, let's just say fraud charges don't look good on a resume." I stood up slowly, my mind already racing ahead. "You're right, Mark. A clean break is best for everyone." He smiled, probably thinking he'd won. Probably already planning how to redistribute my stock options among his inner circle. "I'm glad you understand, Alex. It's just business, nothing personal." Nothing personal. As I walked out of his office for what he thought would be the last time, I felt a strange calm settle over me. He was right about one thing, this was business. And I had learned from the best. I spent the next hour in my office, going through the motions of packing my things. Family photos, industry awards, the coffee mug my team gave me last Christmas. But my hands were busy with more than just boxing up memories. Every click of my mouse, every file transfer, was deliberate and careful. The IT team wouldn't check the logs until tomorrow. Mark would make sure of that, wanting to erase my access quietly after hours. What Mark never understood about me was that I'd grown up in the digital age. While he was still learning to trust email, I was learning about digital footprints, encrypted backups, and the importance of keeping receipts. 6 years of watching him operate had taught me to document everything. Every questionable wire transfer, every suspicious vendor contract, every midnight email about creative solutions to our cash flow problems. I had it all. By 5 o'clock, most of the office had cleared out. Nobody wanted to witness the fall of their former golden boy. Through the glass walls of my soon-to-be former office, I could see the lights still on in Mark's corner suite. Probably celebrating with his inner circle, plotting how to spin this to the board tomorrow. My phone buzzed, a text from Lisa in legal. "I'm so sorry, Alex. I tried to warn you last week, about the irregularities they found." I smiled at my phone. Lisa had indeed tried to warn me, in her careful, lawyer-approved way. What she didn't know was that those irregularities had been exactly what I'd been waiting for. The final pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling for months. I sent back a simple, "Thanks for everything," and slipped my phone into my pocket. My laptop was clean now, all traces of my personal files wiped according to protocol. On my desk, a single USB drive sat innocuously next to my resignation letter. Standard procedure required all company property to be left behind. Mark's people would check my computer, my emails, my network drives. They'd find nothing. They wouldn't check the old filing cabinet in the basement archive room. The one containing hard copies of every board meeting minute I'd ever taken. Or the private cloud server where I'd been backing up Mark's confidential emails for the past 3 years. Or the encrypted drive hidden in my apartment containing audio recordings of every closed-door meeting where Mark had instructed me to adjust our quarterly numbers. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my mind wandered back to a conversation Mark and I had last year, during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "The key to surviving in this business," he'd said, swirling his 18-year-old scotch, "is to always have leverage. Always be the one holding the cards." I stepped out into the cool evening air, my small box of belongings under one arm. Through the glass facade of our building, I could see the lights of Mark's office still burning bright against the darkening sky. In my pocket, my phone contained emails to 3 recipients, the SEC, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and Timothy Chen, the lead partner at the accounting firm conducting our external audit. I thought about Mark's words about leverage as my finger hovered over the send button. He'd taught me well, just not in the way he intended. Tomorrow, he would stand before the board and deliver his carefully crafted story about my betrayal and fraud. He would paint himself as the wounded mentor, the leader who had trusted too much. And then, one by one, the cards would start to fall. I pressed send and hailed a cab. By morning, the wheels I'd set in motion would be turning too fast for even Mark to stop. But that was just the beginning. The official investigation would be thorough but limited in scope. The real damage would come from what I'd arranged to leak to our biggest competitors, to the tech journalists who'd been sniffing around our too-good-to-be-true growth numbers, and to the minority shareholders who'd been questioning our recent acquisitions. The cab driver asked me where I was headed. I gave him an address across town, a boutique law firm specializing in corporate whistleblower cases. I had an appointment with a partner who'd been very interested in what I had to say about Vertex Solutions' business practices. The next 48 hours unfolded exactly as I'd planned, like watching a row of dominoes fall in slow motion. Each piece triggered the next in a cascade that even Mark, with all his connections and resources, couldn't stop. It started with Timothy Chen's team from the auditing firm arriving unannounced at 7 a.m., armed with a new set of anonymous tips that required immediate investigation. By 9 a.m., they had requested access to servers that Mark had specifically kept off-limits during the initial audit. I imagined his face when he realized the carefully constructed paper trail he'd created to frame me was about to lead right back to his own door. At 10:30 a.m., during the board meeting where Mark had planned to formally announce my departure, he instead found himself trying to explain why FBI agents were in the building, reviewing financial records. I wasn't there to see it, but Lisa texted me updates. Apparently, Mark's legendary composure finally cracked and Agent Sarah Martinez started asking very specific questions about certain offshore accounts whose documentation had mysteriously appeared in her inbox that morning. By lunch, Vertex's stock had dropped 12%. The trading algorithms had picked up the unusual law enforcement activity, and the market reacted accordingly. I knew that Mark's largest positions were heavily leveraged. He'd been playing with borrowed money for years, using his stock as collateral. A 20% drop would trigger margin calls he couldn't cover. I spent the afternoon in meetings with federal prosecutors, sharing everything I knew. But the real coup de grace wasn't the official investigation, it was what happened next. At 4 p.m., TechCrunch published an explosive article detailing years of fraudulent acquisitions and inflated valuations at Vertex. The reporter had documents, emails, recordings, all provided by an anonymous source with intimate knowledge of the company's operations. The article went viral within hours. CNBC picked it up. Then Bloomberg. #Vertex fraud was trending on Twitter. The stock ended the day down 38%. But I wasn't done. Not yet. That evening, while Mark was probably huddled with his lawyers, I met with James Wilson, CEO of our biggest competitor. James had been suspicious of Vertex's meteoric rise for years, but he'd never been able to prove his hunches about our creative business practices. The USB drive I handed him contained enough information to unwind every deal Mark had ever made, potentially returning millions to shareholders who'd been deceived during acquisitions. "Why are you doing this?" James asked me after reviewing the files. "You could have asked for money. Protection. A job." I thought about Mark's face when he told me it was just business. About all the people who'd lost their jobs, their savings, their companies because of his schemes. About how he'd been so certain of his own invulnerability that he'd never considered I might be playing a longer game. "Sometimes," I said, echoing Mark's words back to a different audience, "it's about more than money." The next morning, I watched from a coffee shop across the street as Mark arrived at the office for what would be the last time. His Aston Martin pulled into his reserved parking spot at precisely 7:15 a.m., just like every other day. But today was different. Today, he was walking into a trap of his own making. I sipped my coffee and opened my laptop to check the morning news. The Wall Street Journal had just published a detailed exposé on Vertex's House of Cards financial structure. The stock was down another 20% in pre-market trading. Mark's margin calls would be triggering right about now. My phone buzzed, another text from Lisa, FBI just walked into his office. "You need to see this." I looked up through the coffee shop window. Even from across the street, I could see the commotion in the lobby. 3 dark SUVs had pulled up, and agents in windbreakers were entering the building. Among them was Agent Martinez, carrying a very familiar-looking folder. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. Then I saw him, Mark Henderson, being led out in handcuffs. His perfect suit was wrinkled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They scanned the crowd that had gathered, looking for something. Or someone. When his gaze reached the coffee shop window, I didn't hide. I stood there, coffee cup in hand, and met his eyes. For a moment, all the pretense dropped away. No more fake smiles, no more practiced charm. Just pure, unfiltered recognition as he finally understood. "This is your doing," he mouthed silently across the distance. I raised my coffee cup in a small toast. "Just business, nothing personal." They put him in the back of an SUV, and just like that, the mighty Mark Henderson disappeared into the justice system. Within hours, Vertex's board announced an emergency restructuring. By the end of the week, most of Mark's inner circle had either resigned or been fired. The stock eventually stabilized at 12% of its peak value. I did get called in to testify, of course. Spent weeks working with prosecutors, explaining the intricate web of fraud and deception. Some called me a hero, a whistleblower who exposed corporate corruption. Others, mostly those who lost money when Vertex collapsed, called me something else. A traitor. A disgruntled employee who destroyed thousands of jobs out of spite. Maybe they were all right, in their own ways. 6 months later, I was sitting in another office, in another high-rise building. James Wilson had kept his word. The position he offered me came with a corner office and a salary that made my Vertex days look like pocket change. From my window, I could see my old building. New tenants now, the Vertex name long gone from the facade. Alex? My new assistant poked her head in. Mr. Wilson wants to know if you've reviewed the acquisition papers for that tech startup in Seattle. I looked down at the documents on my desk. The numbers didn't quite add up, reminded me of some of Mark's early deals. Small discrepancies, easily missed if you weren't looking for them. The kind of thing that could make ambitious executives very rich if handled creatively. Tell him I'll need more time to review everything, I said. Something doesn't feel right. After she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the papers. I thought about Mark, about power, about how easy it is to justify small compromises until they become big ones. About how revenge, even when perfectly executed, doesn't really change the past. My phone buzzed, a news alert. Mark's sentencing was scheduled for next month. He was facing 20 years. The article mentioned he'd been cooperating with authorities, naming names, revealing schemes that went far beyond Vertex. Even in defeat, he was playing angles, looking for leverage. I opened my drawer and pulled out a small recorder, an old habit I hadn't quite shaken. Pressed record. Notes on the Seattle acquisition, I began. Multiple discrepancies found in Section 3. Some lessons, once learned, are hard to unlearn. Some patterns repeat themselves, with different players in different offices. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Mark's final lesson wasn't about leverage or power, but about how easy it is to become what you set out to destroy. But that's just business, isn't it? Nothing personal.